I spent my life predicting the future. At 28, I was one of the world's best military strategy analysts. Governments hired me to simulate wars. Corporations paid millions for my predictions. Give me a problem and I could calculate thousands of outcomes before anyone else saw them coming. People called me a genius. The funny thing was, I could predict almost everything except my own life. I lived alone in a luxury apartment overlooking the city. Every day was the same: work, reports, simulations, meetings, then back home to an empty room. No family. No friends. No one waiting for me. The only people who ever called needed something from me. For years I told myself success was enough: more money, more recognition, more achievements. But deep down I knew something was missing. One night I received the biggest contract of my career. A government agency needed an urgent military simulation completed within 3 days. I accepted immediately. For 72 hours I barely slept. Coffee replaced food, numbers filled my screen. I pushed my body far beyond its limits because that's what I had always done. On the third night my vision became blurry. My chest started hurting. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Still I kept working. Just one more calculation. Just one more prediction. Then everything went black. As I collapsed onto the floor, my eyes drifted around the apartment. The expensive furniture. The empty rooms. The silence. For the first time in years I felt regret. I had spent my entire life helping others build their futures. Yet I had never built one for myself. Darkness swallowed me. Then I heard a woman crying. My eyes slowly opened. A wooden ceiling hung above me, the air smelled of smoke and dirt. A child was sobbing somewhere nearby. Confused, I sat up and looked around. The room was small, poor, and completely unfamiliar. A woman rushed to my side with tears in her eyes. "Thank goodness you're awake," she whispered. I looked down at my hands. They weren't mine. And in that moment, I realized something impossible. I wasn't in my world anymore. I wasn't in my world anymore. For several seconds, I simply stared at my small hands, trying to understand what had happened. Then a sharp pain rushed through my head. Memories that weren't mine suddenly flooded my mind. This body belonged to a boy named Ethan. He was 12 years old. And he was poor. Very poor. The woman beside me was his mother. The man sleeping near the door was his father. They weren't wealthy merchants or powerful nobles. They were farmers struggling to survive another winter. As the memories settled, my heart grew heavy. This family barely had enough food to eat. That evening, I sat quietly during dinner and watched my mother divide a single loaf of bread among the family. My younger brother and sister immediately grabbed their pieces and ate as if they hadn't seen food in days. Then I noticed something. My mother wasn't eating. Neither was my father. They kept smiling and pretending they weren't hungry. "We already ate earlier," my father said. It was an obvious lie. For the first time in my life, I saw parents willingly go hungry so their children could eat. Back in my previous world, nobody had ever cared about me like that. Nobody had sacrificed anything for me. A strange feeling tightened in my chest. That night while everyone slept, I stared at the ceiling. I had once advised governments and corporations worth billions. Now I belonged to a family that struggled to afford bread. The difference should have terrified me. Instead, all I could think about was helping them. At that moment, a strange light suddenly appeared before my eyes. A voice echoed inside my head. "Skill acquired, eyes of possibility." I froze. Then countless images exploded through my mind. I saw myself planting crops. One future ended in drought. Another ended in profit. I saw myself walking into town. One future led to failure. Another led to opportunity. Thousands of possibilities appeared and disappeared within seconds. My heart began racing. This wasn't imagination. I was seeing real outcomes. Real futures. For the first time since arriving in this world, I smiled. Maybe fate hadn't brought me here by accident. Maybe this was my second chance. And this time, I wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, I decided to test my new ability. Standing in the middle of our small field, I focused on the crops. Almost instantly, countless visions appeared before my eyes. In one future, a disease destroyed half the harvest. In another, heavy rain flooded the field. In a third, we harvested more food than ever before. The visions vanished as quickly as they came. My heart raced. The eyes of possibility were real. Over the following weeks, I began using the skill every day. I planted crops in different locations, adjusted planting times, and avoided decisions that led to poor outcomes. Whenever I faced a choice, I searched for the future with the best result. At first, my parents thought I was simply lucky. Then the harvest arrived. For the first time in years, our family had more food than we needed. My father stared at the overflowing baskets in disbelief. My mother cried when she realized we wouldn't go hungry that winter. But I didn't stop there. When villagers discussed their fields, I quietly gave advice. I warned them about bad planting locations and suggested better ones. Some ignored me, others listened. The ones who listened saw their harvests improve. Soon people started coming to our house asking for help. The strange thing was that helping them felt better than any success I had achieved in my previous life. Back then, my predictions made rich people richer. Here my decisions help families eat. Months passed and our lives slowly changed. The leaking roof was repaired. My younger siblings stopped going to bed hungry. My mother even started smiling more often. One evening after dinner, I overheard my parents talking. My father looked toward me and shook his head with a smile. I still can't believe he's our son. My mother laughed softly. He's a miracle. A miracle. Nobody had ever called me that before. In my previous life, people admired my intelligence. They respected my work, but nobody looked at me the way my parents did. Not with pride. Not with love. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt like I belonged somewhere. As I looked around the table at my family laughing together, I made a silent promise. No matter what happened in this world, I would protect this happiness. I had been given a second chance. And this time, I wasn't going to lose the people who cared about me. By the following year, our family's situation had improved more than anyone thought possible. We still weren't rich, but we no longer worried about starving through the winter. My younger siblings had food on their plates, and for the first time, my parents could sleep without constantly worrying about the next harvest. I thought life would finally become peaceful. I was wrong. One morning, a wealthy merchant arrived in our village. He owned several warehouses in the nearby town and controlled most of the local trade. The villagers respected him because they believed he brought prosperity. But the moment I saw him, my instincts told me something was wrong. As I watched him negotiate with the farmers, I activated the eyes of possibility. Thousands of futures flashed before me. In almost every one of them, the villagers lost money. The merchant was manipulating the prices. He would buy crops for almost nothing, store them for a few weeks, then sell them back to nearby towns for several times their value. The villagers worked for months while he took most of the profit. The worst part was that nobody realized they were being cheated. That evening, the merchant approached my father. "I'll buy your entire harvest," he said with a smile. The offer sounded generous. To everyone except me. Using my ability, I followed every possible outcome of the deal. In seconds, I discovered exactly how he planned to trick us. The next morning, the entire village gathered in the marketplace. The merchant confidently announced his prices. Then I stepped forward. At first, people laughed. I was just a farmer's son. What could I possibly know? But I calmly exposed every part of his scheme, the false numbers, the hidden profits, the fake shortages he had created to manipulate prices. The merchant tried to deny it. Unfortunately for him, I had already predicted every excuse he would make. Every lie was answered before he could finish speaking. The crowd slowly turned against him. For the first time, panic appeared on the merchant's face. By sunset, he was forced to leave the village in humiliation. The farmers kept their harvests and later sold them for nearly double the amount he had offered. That night the village celebrated. My father had never looked prouder. My mother couldn't stop smiling. But while everyone else was celebrating, I noticed something unusual. A carriage had arrived near the edge of the village. Inside sat several well-dressed men. Nobles. They had watched everything. As the carriage pulled away, one of them glanced back at me with clear interest. For some reason, I had a feeling this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. And I was right. A week after the merchant incident, a royal carriage arrived at our village. This time, the nobles weren't watching from a distance. They had come for me. My parents were terrified. They thought I had somehow offended an important noble. But when the officials explained that I was being invited to the capital, I saw something completely different in my father's eyes. Pride. For years, he had struggled just to keep our family alive. Now powerful men were traveling across the kingdom to meet his son. The journey to the capital took several days. When I finally arrived, I was brought before a group of noble officials. They didn't trust me. To them, I was just a farmer's child who had gotten lucky. So they decided to test me. One official presented a trade problem that had been hurting several provinces for years. Another asked how to increase tax revenue without making people suffer. A third asked how to prevent food shortages during difficult seasons. Each time I activated the eyes of possibility. Thousands of outcomes appeared before me. Within minutes, I found solutions that would have taken others years to discover. The officials became quieter after every answer. Then news arrived that several farming regions were facing a severe drought. Panic spread through the council. A drought meant failed harvests. Failed harvests meant starvation. Using my ability, I studied countless futures until I found a solution. Villages needed to store water immediately and switch to crops that required less rainfall. Many officials doubted me. Months later, the drought arrived exactly as I predicted. But because preparations had already been made, thousands of families were saved. The kingdom never forgot it. Soon, I was helping redesign trade routes between major cities. Travel times decreased. Merchants earned more money. Villages gained access to supplies they had never seen before. Every success brought more attention. Every problem solved brought more recognition. Rumors spread from town to town. People began speaking about a mysterious boy who could see solutions nobody else could. Some called me a genius. Others called me blessed by the heavens. But whenever I returned home and saw my family smiling, none of those titles mattered. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't helping strangers become richer. I was helping people live better lives. And somewhere far away in the royal capital, those rumors had finally reached the ears of someone very important. The king. The rumors about me continued spreading across the kingdom, then war arrived. A neighboring nation suddenly invaded our northern border. At first, everyone believed our army would stop them easily. They were wrong. Forts began falling one after another, and every report that reached the capital carried more bad news. The army was losing. One morning, royal officials rushed into the council chamber where I was working. The northern front may collapse, one of them said. For the first time since arriving in this world, I felt genuine fear. If the border fell, thousands of innocent people would die. I activated the eyes of possibility. Countless futures appeared before me. In one, the enemy captured entire cities. In another, villages burned. In another, the kingdom surrendered. Every path seemed to end in disaster. For 2 days, I barely slept. I searched through future after future until I finally found it. One path. One chance to win. The plan was dangerous. The enemy army was larger and stronger, but if we attacked their supply lines and lured them into the northern valleys, their advantage would disappear. Many commanders thought I was insane. The army followed the strategy anyway. Everything unfolded exactly as I had seen. The enemy pushed deeper into our territory, believing they were winning. Then the trap closed. Their supplies vanished, their formations broke apart, and our forces surrounded them from multiple directions. The battle that should have ended in defeat became an overwhelming victory. When news reached the capital, celebrations erupted across the kingdom. The invasion had been stopped. The kingdom had survived. A few days later, a royal messenger arrived at my home carrying a golden scroll. My father stared at it in shock. My mother couldn't stop trembling. Slowly I opened it. The king requests your presence at the royal palace. As I read those words, I realized my life was about to change forever. A week later I arrived at the capital. Even after everything I had accomplished, the sight of the royal city left me speechless. Massive stone walls surrounded the kingdom's heart and countless people filled the streets. In my previous life I had seen modern cities worth billions, yet somehow this place felt far more alive. The royal palace was even more impressive. After meeting several officials, I was escorted into the palace gardens while waiting for my audience with the king. That was where I met her. Princess Alina. She was standing beside a fountain, dressed in elegant royal attire. Several knights and attendants stood nearby, but somehow she commanded all the attention in the area. For a moment I understood why people spoke so highly of her beauty. Then she opened her mouth. "So you're the famous genius everyone keeps talking about." Something about her tone immediately annoyed me. I nodded politely, "And you must be the princess." She crossed her arms. "You don't seem very impressed." I almost laughed. I've spent my entire life around important people. Titles stopped impressing me a long time ago. The moment those words left my mouth, I knew I had made a mistake. Her eyes narrowed instantly. To Alina, it probably sounded like arrogance. To me, it was simply the truth. Unfortunately, things only became worse. Throughout the conversation, she questioned almost everything I said. Every answer I gave seemed to irritate her even more. Meanwhile, I couldn't help noticing how sheltered she seemed. Surrounded by servants and luxury her entire life, she spoke confidently about problems she had never personally experienced. By the end of the conversation, neither of us was happy. As I turned to leave, Alina spoke one final sentence. "I expected someone wiser." I stopped and looked back. "And I expected someone humbler." The garden became completely silent. For a second, I thought the guards might arrest me. Instead, Alina simply stared at me in disbelief. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that before. Honestly, nobody had ever irritated me that quickly either. As I walked away, I couldn't stop shaking my head. A spoiled princess. That was my first impression of Alina. What I didn't know was that she was thinking something very similar. An arrogant commoner. Neither of us realized it then, but that disastrous first meeting was only the beginning of a story that would change both our lives forever. The next day, I was finally summoned before the king. The throne room was filled with nobles, generals, and royal officials. Every important person in the kingdom seemed to be present. The king studied me for several moments before smiling. "So you're the young man who saved my kingdom." His voice carried through the entire hall. I bowed respectfully. I simply did what anyone should do. A few nobles immediately frowned. They probably thought I was being arrogant. The king, however, laughed. For the next hour he questioned me about the war, the economy, and the future of the kingdom. Every answer seemed to impress him more. Then without warning he stood from his throne. "I've made my decision." The room fell silent. "I want this young man to marry my daughter." For a moment nobody moved. Then the entire court exploded into whispers. The nobles looked horrified. The generals looked shocked. Even I froze. Before I could say a word, a familiar voice echoed through the hall. "No." Princess Alina had just entered the room. Everyone turned toward her. She walked forward and looked directly at the king. "I refuse." The court became even quieter. The king sighed as if he had expected this reaction. Alina then looked at me. Honestly, the expression on her face was almost insulting. As if marrying me would be some kind of punishment. Unfortunately, I wasn't very happy about the idea either. I looked at the king and calmly said, "Your Majesty, with all due respect, I have no interest in marrying someone who clearly dislikes me." Gasps spread throughout the hall. Alina's eyes widened. The king started laughing. Meanwhile, the princess looked like she wanted to throw something at me. That day the marriage proposal went nowhere. But from that moment on, a strange rivalry began between us. Whenever we met we argued. Whenever we spoke we disagreed. And somehow every encounter only made things. Over the following months, my responsibilities continued to grow. The king trusted me with more projects and I threw myself into the work. Roads that had been neglected for years were repaired, allowing villages to trade more easily. New supply routes reduced food costs across the kingdom. When a poor region faced another food shortage, I organized emergency shipments before anyone went hungry. For me, it wasn't about recognition. I simply remembered what it felt like to be poor. I remembered my younger brother and sister going to bed hungry. I never wanted another family to experience that. What I didn't know was that Princess Alina had started watching me. At first she was looking for flaws. She expected me to be arrogant. She expected me to abuse the king's trust. She expected me to eventually reveal my true nature. Instead, every place she visited told the same story. Farmers praised the new roads. Merchants praised the improved trade routes. Parents thanked the kingdom for preventing food shortages. And somehow my name was always connected to it. One afternoon, Alina secretly visited a small village I had recently helped. There she saw something that surprised her. An elderly woman grabbed my hands and began crying. "You saved us," she said. "We would have lost everything." I smiled and gently shook my head. "No, you saved yourselves, I only pointed the way." The woman wasn't the only one. Everywhere I went, people treated me with gratitude. Not because I was powerful. Because I genuinely cared. For the first time, Alina began questioning her opinion of me. Maybe I wasn't the arrogant commoner she thought I was. Maybe she had been wrong. And the more she watched, the harder it became to ignore a strange feeling growing inside her heart. A feeling she had never expected to have. Especially for someone she once couldn't stand. Just as peace finally seemed within reach, disaster arrived. One morning, scouts rushed into the capital carrying news that turned the entire kingdom silent. A massive empire from the east had begun marching toward our borders. At first, nobody understood the scale of the threat. Then the numbers arrived. The enemy army was nearly 10 times larger than ours. The moment the reports became public, panic spread across the kingdom. Merchants started hiding their wealth. Noble families prepared escape plans. Villagers prayed for miracles. Even the military commanders looked defeated. Emergency meetings were held day and night, but every discussion ended the same way. Defeat. There was simply no way to stop an army that large. For the first time since I met him, I saw fear in the king's eyes. The man who had led the kingdom for decades suddenly looked older. Tired. Broken. One evening, I entered the royal council chamber and found complete silence. The generals sat with their heads lowered. Nobody was discussing strategies anymore. They were discussing how long the kingdom could survive. One commander finally stood. "We should surrender." No one argued. That frightened me more than the invasion itself. The kingdom hadn't lost yet. But its leaders already had. As I looked around the room, my eyes met Alina's. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes too. Not fear for herself. Fear for her people. Fear for her father. Fear for everything she loved. At that moment I realized something. If the empire won, my family would die. The villages I had helped would burn. Everything we had built would disappear. The room remained silent as everyone accepted their fate. Everyone except me. Because while they were preparing for defeat, I had already begun searching through the future. And what I found terrified me. Out of countless possible futures, almost every single one ended with the kingdom's destruction. Almost. Which meant one thing. Somewhere among those futures, there was still a path to victory. That night I locked myself inside my room and activated the eyes of possibility. Instantly, countless futures flooded my mind. In one future, our army fought bravely and was completely annihilated. In another, the king surrendered, only to be betrayed and executed after handing over the kingdom. In another, the nobles fled while the common people were left behind to suffer. No matter where I looked, the ending never changed. Defeat. I continued searching. Hundreds of futures became thousands, thousands became tens of thousands, every possibility brought a new tragedy. Then I saw my village. The fields where I had grown up were burning. The house my family had worked so hard to rebuild collapsed into flames. My father died protecting my mother. My younger brother and sister never escaped. My hands began trembling. I forced myself to keep searching. The next future showed the capital. The city walls had fallen, smoke covered the sky, bodies filled the streets, the palace burned as enemy banners rose above it. Then I saw Alina. She stood alone among the ruins, desperately looking for her father. Fear filled her eyes, but there was nowhere left to run. A moment later she disappeared too. I immediately switched to another future. And another. And another. But every path led to the same nightmare. Families destroyed. Children orphaned. Cities reduced to ashes. The kingdom erased from history. Hours passed, then more hours. By sunrise, blood was dripping from my nose, my vision was blurry and my entire body felt like it would collapse at any moment. Millions of possible futures. Millions of deaths. Not a single victory. For the first time since arriving in this world, I felt truly helpless. Maybe fate had already chosen our ending. Maybe some battles simply couldn't be won. Then, just as I was about to stop searching, a new future appeared. The vision lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds changed everything. For the first time all night, I didn't see fire. I didn't see death. I didn't see the kingdom fall. I saw hope. And somewhere inside that future, I saw a path to victory. The moment the vision disappeared, I almost fell from my chair. My entire body was shaking. Blood stained my clothes. My head felt like it was being torn apart. I had searched through millions of futures, and every second of it had pushed the eyes of possibility beyond its limits. But none of that mattered. For the first time, I had found a path where the kingdom survived. I immediately activated the skill again and focused on that future. The vision returned. This time I followed it carefully. The deeper I looked, the more terrifying it became. Victory was possible. But it came at a terrible cost. The army would have to abandon several border cities. Thousands of soldiers would need to act as bait. Entire battalions would knowingly march into battles they couldn't win. Every commander would have to trust a plan that seemed completely insane. One mistake would destroy everything. If a messenger arrived late, the kingdom would fall. If a general ignored orders, the kingdom would fall. If the enemy noticed even a single part of the trap, the kingdom would fall. The future balanced on the edge of a knife. I continued watching. Again and again. Each time the outcome remained the same. There was only one path. One future. One chance. And it required sacrifices that would break the hearts of everyone involved. For several minutes I simply sat there in silence. The people following this plan would never know the burden they carried. Many would march toward danger, believing they were being abandoned. Many would never return home. Yet without their sacrifice, millions more would die. Tears slowly formed in my eyes. This wasn't a game. These weren't numbers on a screen. These were real people. My people. My family. Elena. The king. The villagers who had trusted me. The kingdom that had become my home. I wiped the blood from my face and slowly stood up. The path was cruel. The path was dangerous. But it existed. And as long as even one future remained where the people I loved survived, I would fight for it. No matter the cost. The next morning, I presented the plan to the king and his generals. At first they thought I had lost my mind. Abandon border cities. Split our already smaller army. Allow the enemy to advance deeper into our territory. It sounded like a strategy for defeat. But after hours of explanation, the king made his decision. We follow the plan. Within days, the kingdom began moving. The enemy believed they were winning. That was exactly what I wanted. As their massive army pushed forward, our forces retreated according to schedule. Villages were evacuated, roads were blocked, bridges were destroyed. Every step the enemy took led them deeper into the trap. Then the second phase began. Small groups of soldiers launched surprise attacks on supply caravans. Food wagons disappeared during the night. Messengers were intercepted. Communication between enemy commanders slowly broke down. Confusion spread through their ranks. Soon rumors started appearing. Some believed their generals had betrayed them. Others believed a second kingdom had joined the war. The enemy no longer knew what to believe. That uncertainty became our greatest weapon. Weeks passed. The once unstoppable army was growing hungry, exhausted, and divided. Then the final battle arrived. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers filled the valley. The enemy commander stood confidently at the front of his army, believing victory was only hours away. He had no idea that every step he had taken over the past month had been part of my plan. The moment his forces entered the valley, our hidden troops attacked from both sides. Archers rained arrows from the cliffs. Explosives destroyed the narrow mountain passes behind them. The enemy army suddenly realized it was trapped. Panic erupted. Orders stopped making sense. Formations collapsed. The mighty army that had terrified an entire kingdom began tearing itself apart. As the battle continued, I watched from a distant hill beside the king. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had seen. Every movement. Every decision. Every sacrifice. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The invading empire had fallen. The kingdom had won. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then cheers erupted across the battlefield. Soldiers cried. Generals embraced each other. The king fell to his knees and thanked the heavens. As I looked across the valley, tears slowly filled my eyes. Not because we had won, but because for the first time in weeks, I could finally see a future where the people I loved survived. And that future was now reality. The victory celebrations lasted for days. Every street in the capital was filled with laughter. People who had spent months fearing the end of the kingdom could finally breathe again, families reunited. Soldiers returned home. For the first time in a long while, hope had replaced fear. A week later, the king held a grand ceremony in the royal palace. Nobles, generals, merchants, and officials from across the kingdom gathered in the throne room. I stood before them as the king rose from his throne. "You saved this kingdom," he said. "You saved my people, you saved my family." The entire hall erupted into applause. Then the king smiled. "As your reward, you may ask for anything." The room immediately fell silent. Anything. Land. Titles. Gold. Power. I looked around the hall before shaking my head. I already have everything I need. The king stared at me in surprise. So did everyone else. Then a familiar voice broke the silence. "I don't." Every head turned. Princess Alina slowly stepped forward. Her hands were trembling. For the first time since I had met her, she looked nervous. She stopped in front of me and took a deep breath. "When we first met, I thought you were arrogant." Laughter spread through parts of the hall. Alina smiled weakly. "I judged you before I understood you. I doubted you when I should have trusted you." The room became quiet again. She looked directly into my eyes. "I was wrong." For a moment nobody spoke. Then tears began forming in her eyes. "I watched you work for people who could never repay you. I watched you risk everything for this kingdom, and when everyone lost hope, you still kept fighting." Her voice started shaking. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing a commoner. My heart began racing. The entire kingdom seemed to disappear around us. "There is nobody I admire more than you." The hall was completely silent. Then Alina smiled. "And if you're willing, I'd like to spend the rest of my life beside you." For several seconds I couldn't speak. The princess who once couldn't stand me was standing before the entire kingdom with tears in her eyes. Slowly I smiled. "I'd like that too." The hall exploded with cheers. The king laughed louder than anyone. And as Alina wiped away her tears, I realized something. Out of all the futures I had seen, this was my favorite one. A few days later, wedding preparations began throughout the kingdom. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to predict. It felt like something I couldn't wait to live. A year later, Princess Alina and I were married. The wedding became one of the largest celebrations in the kingdom's history. People traveled from distant towns and villages to witness it. As I stood beside Alina, watching thousands of smiling faces, I couldn't help remembering the lonely man I used to be. Back in my previous life, I had everything except the people who mattered. Now I finally understood what true wealth looked like. The years that followed were peaceful. My parents never had to worry about money again. The small farming family that once struggled to afford bread now lived comfortably. My father spent most of his time teaching younger farmers while my mother finally had the peaceful life she deserved. My younger brother and sister received the best education in the kingdom. Opportunities that once seemed impossible became normal parts of their lives. The kingdom prospered as well. Trade flourished, new roads connected distant regions, harvests improved, businesses grew. For the first time in generations, people spoke about the future with excitement instead of fear. It became known as the kingdom's golden age. Of course, not everything was perfect. One afternoon, Alina decided it was finally time to teach me proper swordsmanship. You can't be the kingdom's greatest strategist and still hold a sword like that, she said. I disagreed. She disagreed harder. A few minutes later, we stood in the training yard. I activated the eyes of possibility and immediately saw dozens of possible attacks. A smile appeared on my face. This would be easy. 10 seconds later, I was lying face first in the dirt. Alina stood above me trying and failing not to laugh. How I complained, I literally saw that attack coming. She grinned and extended a hand. Seeing it and stopping it are two different things. The guards nearby couldn't stop laughing. Neither could Alina. Eventually, I started laughing too. Years ago, I would have been embarrassed. Now it was one of my favorite memories. That evening, I sat on a balcony overlooking the kingdom. Alina sat beside me while my parents and siblings talked and laughed nearby. The setting sun painted the horizon gold. For a long moment, I simply watched. The peaceful cities. The happy people. The family I loved. Then I thought about my previous life. I had spent years predicting the future. Wars. Economies. Outcomes. Possibilities. I could see countless futures. Yet despite all that knowledge, I had never found happiness. Not once. But in this world, everything was different. I had found a family. I had found a home. I had found the woman I loved. As Alina gently rested her head on my shoulder, a smile appeared on my face. For the first time in both of my lives, I wasn't thinking about the future. I was simply grateful for the present. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something. Out of all the futures I had ever seen, this was the one worth living for.